Welcome to the podcast. Welcome, Praveen.
Thank you for having me, Manju. Pleasure to be here.
For the audience, it's a pleasure and honor to have Praveen Rao with us today. Praveen Rao is the Global Head of Manufacturing Industry at Google Cloud. Praveen, you work closely with manufacturers across regions and maturity level. When companies begin with AI in one plant, what usually triggers that first move? And when do leaders realize that a successful pilot is not the same as scalable transformation?
Yeah, no, there is two parts to that question, right? One is what triggers their desire to jump into something unknown, and then why does it get stuck? So there are multiple reasons why the thing gets initiated for them to explore. One is number one reason is the leadership, right? There are certain companies who are innovators who are always on the cutting edge, and they want to innovate. They really want to transform, right? So they oftentimes are looking for what else can I do, how else can I improve, right? So that's one kind of category of customers that you see. Other kind of category is kind of where they get pulled in because they see their competitors doing, and then or their suppliers or some their partners telling them, hey, you should be on it. And then there is this third kind of customers who are like this FOMO, fear of missing out, saying, hey, everybody's on it. If I'm not on it, so then I could be in trouble, so let me jump in and see what it is, kind of a thing. So, and that's what you see in the crossing the chasm too. So right, in terms of the innovators to laggards, kind of a thing, right? So that's common with most of the technology. So second thing is, why do they not always scale up? So I think you hear this pilot purgatory, right, which is very common, where are death by pilots, right? Because oftentimes when they pilot something, there will be a lot of excitement. They bring in their A team, and they pick usually the best either plant or a problem. A lot of visibility, it comes from there, either like C-suite, so there is like sponsorship and excitement. So there is a lot of motivation for people to kind of show that they are leading the way. And then once that excitement kind of subsides, or once that pilot gets delivered, then you get into this void or this chasm, right? Because then you may not get the middle level support, because middle level managers are simply executing. They got an request from their C-suite. They can't say no. They don't understand why, and they try to execute it, and it doesn't work, and they give up, right? So the most important thing is to understand why you do what you do versus, hey, there is a nice shiny object, let me go adopt it and wear it as a badge, kind of a thing, right? Because other thing is, when you do the pilots, oftentimes things are held by duct tape to make it work. But then when you take it to the production, so the duct tape architecture would not work, right? And you're dealing with data silos fatigue, and then there is other things in terms of corporate push versus factory pull. So there would be a lot of challenges in terms of the sponsorship, and then the leadership oftentimes they go to the next shiny object in there to support them, so then not necessarily stay in and see the results all the way through production.
That's amazing, Praveen. You travel around the world, you meet some of the largest enterprises and the most complex enterprises in their own verticals. Why is scaling so hard in manufacturing?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting question, right? So one thing we talked about, the duct tape architecture, right? So where when you do the pilots, things work, and then when you take it to real test, then you have this whole museum of machines problem, right? Because manufacturing industry, you have what, 300 plus protocols, MQTT, Modbus, UPC, right? And I haven't encountered a single factory where all the machines are homogeneous, right? You have multiple vendors, and the machines deliberately don't talk to each other, and then you have this networking issues among them. They're not all to the same standard. And then ISA architecture, while it added benefit, it also creates a lot of challenges in terms of the data movement across the different tiers of that. right? And then not having like sponsorship to kind of navigate all these things, right? Having a good hub sub model to essentially subscribe to different insights, and then also not having a good asset hierarchy, right? In terms of how you want to drive across, or in your plant, in your site within the plant, cell, your machine, your operator, right? Your shift. So getting all those things is oftentimes very difficult. And then when you try to scale up, oftentimes you get this fatigue of alerts. If you're doing one pilot, you get alerts, it's pretty cool. But then you scale it to 50 factory and you get like 5,000 alerts per day. Like, this what worked in pilot won't work when you scale, because you get this fatigue of alert. And then the last thing is this verification tax, right? So that means if a human makes mistakes, you forgive oftentimes, but if AI makes a mistake one time, and if human verifies it, then that becomes like, they started verifying double, triple. So if there is a trust lost in the AI solution, then that verification tax becomes a burden, which oftentimes slows down the whole implementation because the whole trust is not there, right? To build that trust, you have to go much farther to gain it back to where it was.
Yeah, that's amazing, Praveen. There's so many elements that you touched in that answer, right? As in, there is the people aspect of it, there's technology aspect of it, there's the aging of the technology, and there's the layers of technology. They all don't work with each other. Now, you already answered part of it. Many pilots succeed, but when it goes to global scale, it becomes a challenge. Uh, when you look at a company, when they succeed, let's say even in one factory, but when they try to go around the regions and countries and globally try to make it consistent, it's hard. We've seen that with beer manufacturing companies, toilet manufacturing companies. What's your perspective on what can change or can be better as time progresses?
Yeah, I mean, there's number of things, right? So the most important thing is I always advocate take a farmer's approach when it comes to implementing AI, right? Because many companies take a hunter approach, right? They think that, well, I need a problem now, I need to solve it, I need to solve it now. So, it's like the way hunters would go to feed themselves, right? So AI projects in general transformation don't work that way, right? So you got to think like a farmer. You got to first prepare your soil for your projects, which is your data architecture, or data infrastructure, data models, everything with the data, right? Connecting the data, stitching the data so it makes sense. Once you get the soil prepared, then you got to pick the right seeds. So which is your, the technology, like your right LLMs, predictive models, generative models, what kind of things that you technology that you use, right? That's very important. And then you got to pick the right crops that seeds corresponds to, which is the outcome that you are trying to solve, right? In our case, it's a digital twin or predictive asset optimization, right? And then you got to make sure that you use the right farm equipment for harvesting and even preparing, right? Which is kind of your technology infrastructure, right? Like the AI infrastructure, which is your, should I use TPU? Should I use GPU, right? Or HPC for that matter. And then you got to make sure that you give it enough care through your, executive sponsorship, encouragement, enough sunlight and those kind of a things, so that they bloom and bear fruit for you. And then, you can feed a lot more, and it's going to continue to give you benefit because you did the hard work initially. You're not impatient, right? And you let it form, and then then you can expand into different fields and continue to generate. And that's super important. But if you just plant a seed and say, hey, I'm not getting the fruit tomorrow and I'm just going to kill it and go on to the next thing, then you do the same thing, right? Again and again and again. It's a cascading failure that happens. So that's kind of where leadership above all makes the big difference.
Very, very well said. I love the farming analogy and how it's a patient journey. Doing the right things in the right order gets you to that massive crop. And of course, when it comes to technology, there is the pace of change, the rate of change we are seeing today, at least in some layers, are incredibly fast. Right
Yeah.
now, when you apply all of this to a factory or a set of factories across regions, what needs to come together in what order? There is, because companies hear many things, right? Digital twins and data cloud, and now the LLMs and physical robotics and all these elements. So executives generally are a bit overwhelmed. So do you have an advice on how they should shape the journey for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the first and foremost important thing is getting a good handle on the data, right? So the data, you when you talk about data, you're talking about multiple tiers of data. One is, what type of data that I should be dealing with: OT data, IT data, right? Because if you think about a company, manufacturing in general produces about 4.4 zettabytes of data. That is like one followed by 21 zeros. It's million times more than a peta, right? Zettabytes, astronomical amount of data, right? Now, in that data lies everything you want to know about your company. What's happening in the company, why it's happening, what can you do about it, kind of a thing. So the reason why you're not knowing about it is because, we just don't know how to handle it and harness the insights from it. So that's where, having a good handle on the data, uh, in a way that would make sense. Because right now, if you think about it, if you go to MES and ask how many units were produced today, you get like 900. If you go ask, SAP, that says 2,500. So which is true, right? Part of the reason why it's happening is in ISA 95 pyramid, every time you move the data, you're moving your metadata, transactional data, all the data, right? So instead, they should think about having a unified namespace and essentially a data that is contextualized across OT and IT, prepared so that you could get into some kind of a pub sub model where all your systems subscribe to the same data. So that way you have the single source of truth, which is very important. And then you got to think about in terms of the data security, sovereignty, those kind of a thing, right? And then where do you process that? Then once you have the data, then you get into the compute side of it. Where do you process the data? If you're generating a lot of data, it's better to do it at edge. If the data doesn't need to go to the cloud, there is no reason why you need to take the data to the cloud, right? So the insight should be done at that. And then having a good architecture, this edge to cloud, is very important, right? And once you have that, identifying, okay, I have the data, I know how to handle it, what problems I want to solve. The why is very important in any transformation. And how comes next? What is the outcome that I'm trying to drive from this? Because if you think about manufacturing in general, so oftentimes not having real-time visibility leads to unplanned breakdown. That leads to essentially breakage of your processes. That leads to quality issues. That leads to waste and scrap. And eventually, like your bottom line loss, a reputational risk because you didn't deliver it. So if you scale back, oftentimes it's as simple as not having real-time visibility led to all this thing. It's like that nursery rhyme, not having the nail in the horseshoe brought the whole kingdom down. That's kind of the thing that you're talking about. So understanding, okay, so what is the thing? I want to make sure I have budgeted this much. I don't want to have any unplanned breakdown. That's the outcome you're driving. That's one thing. Or you could say, look, I don't have enough skilled resources. I want to take my generalist, turn them into specialists using the AI, right? Or I could say, my energy costs are going high. I want to do less, do more with less, or same with less energy. So it's very important on what you are trying to do. Are you trying to do agility? Are you trying to gain efficiency? Are you trying to do cost takeout? Are you trying to do safety recall? Right. So having the clarity and then aligning your data infrastructure, governance, end-to-end architecture to deliver that and be patient about it is super critical.
That's amazing. Obviously, your experience reflects in what you just said, Praveen.
Thank you.
The business outcome clarity, and then working backward to say to get to that, the how part before the how part of it, what, why, and when, and planning that. And as you are narrating it, and I was reflecting back over last 10 years working alongside Google and being on the factory floors, the good and bad of me staying in California is okay, you get to be in front of technology all the time. But the bad is the physical world operates very differently. As you're describing those, what it takes to enable these in the factories and the focusing on that one problem, like you said, I think it's the nail in the horseshoe. Focusing on that and making sure that everything revolves around that one use case and it's done right, and then of course scaling becomes easier. It's fascinating how you mentioned now these days. I'm sure, Praveen, you're in front of leadership and executives all reading their own interpretation of AI and robotics and coming into their factory, into their desks, into their offices. What is the sentiment you're hearing, and what's your advice to them?
Yeah, I mean, it's like what's happening, right? Because what worked yesterday won't necessarily work today, right? What got you here won't get you where you need to go. So that's the most important thing. While you don't want to approach anything from the FOMO perspective, right? You want to approach it because you want to real genuinely drive your business and you understand the problem. That's why I think it's Isaac Newton, right? He said if you only have 60 minutes to solve a problem, spend 59 minutes understanding why and what. And then, so I know it's an extreme example, but having a solid grip on your problem, is super important. Understand your problem. Once you understand it, you understand the root cause, why it's happening. You're almost half there in terms of solving that, right? Having that grip, and then just take an outcome based approach. And then there are plenty of technology out there, right, in terms of what you want to do, right? And then build a team around that. Yeah, make sure that once you build a team, make sure you play to strength, because you don't want to boil the ocean. Know your strengths and weaknesses, right? So leverage partners when you can, right? Like Pluto 7 is a great example. You guys go in and repeat the plays, and you do this, you've been doing this is your bread and butter. Like if I'm a manufacturing customer, if I'm making equipment, that's my strength. So I thrive in that. So you want to create a situation where whole is larger than the sum of part. But if you want to be in everything for everybody, that becomes hard, right? So that's where having good clarity on who can solve and engaging with the right partners, right, in terms of how you want to generate it and what outcomes you want to generate it, and then try it out. I always tell people, think big, start small, move really fast.
Thank you, Praveen. I think that last statement is worth repeating many times in many settings. Now, and also thanks for the kind words. One of the things that I've learned 10 years working with Google as an ecosystem, and is really when Google releases a white paper, like one of your white papers recently on agentic AI, there's a lot of energy that goes behind when you publish it out there. One of the things that caught my attention is the agentic AI, the convergence and simplicity of the technology with LLMs, with the physical robots. Now the robots doesn't need to follow fixed instructions, but rather they can think more dynamically based on situation. And how, to your earlier point that you made, which is the robots, while they can do the physics aspect of it, but the brains is still your data foundation. How you brought all of them together into the white paper. And from what I've seen, Google is usually thinking 1, 3, 5 years out and educating the market. Anything you want to highlight about your white paper that people should be really acting on it now?
No, I mean, the thanks to all the customers who teach us too, right? So I'm kind of so privileged to be in the role that I'm in, where I get to interact with so many innovators in our industry and then learn from their experience. And they allow us to participate in some of their futuristic plans. And that's what kind of powers our thinking as well. right? I think the biggest challenge that you see in the market is the gap between insights and action, right? So earlier, we were talking about analytics, statistics. Then the from structured data came unstructured data handling. Then we went into descriptive, predictive, prescriptive insight, but still we are stuck in the insights era, right? If you think about it, that's why I use that word fatigue of alerts, right? You want insights, but if I give you 10,000 insights on everything you could do, at the end of the day you only have so much time. So what happens is you ignore everything, right? So you want to move beyond insights into actions, whether you want to action autonomously what you can, right, with you are comfortable, or with human in the loop just before you push the button. So you want it to be one step closer than just being told here is all the 10,000 things that is not going well or you should be doing, right? So that's a big gap. So, in order to do that, you have a big challenge because, from the technology perspective, it's a lot easier to solve a chess or a Go problem than a Jenga problem, right? Because Jenga has a lot more variability. If you think about it, a lot more things can go wrong when it comes to that. It's much harder because you're dealing with spatial, constraints and geometric constraints, which are beyond your text and number constraints, right? So you're dealing with the real world where you have multiple degrees of motion, right? That's why having a general purpose robot is very hard thing to do, right? That's why AGI is a dream, right? Artificial general intelligence. That's why we're marching towards. Nobody is guaranteeing you that, oh, it's going to be out next week or next year, come get it, kind of a thing, right? Because it's truly a hard problem to solve. So some of the things that we are doing is essentially like we have introduced several algorithms in terms of how you can train models, and how once you train the models, how you can kind of build a social media kind of effort or a internet kind of effort. That's why your RTSX Foundation, we have 20 plus companies and consortiums where if I train my robot on certain physical action, I can share that with you that you could use it in your robot without you having to train your robot on certain things. So it is all getting there. But the thing that I want to highlight is the kind of the challenge we have from action to insight, how complex it is, and why it takes all hands on the deck to solve it, right? Because you want robots to have three things, right? You want it to be general purpose, you want it to be interactive, where you don't just want it to act, you also want it to access the repository of knowledge, whether it's your knowledge of your company or knowledge of the industry or knowledge of the governmental regulations into its action. And then you want to act, in certain cases, more extreme dexterous actions too, right? So which is also another level of complexity if you think about it. That's why I use that word Jenga, where you need to act in a very finesse matter, right? So that's why that's what makes the future exciting too, because when you solve all these things, there are things that we could do that we could only dream of right now.
Yeah, Praveen, the world is getting more and more exciting, at the same time being pragmatic about what's more closer and real today versus AGI and the
Mhm.
super intelligence, which is further away. When we reflect back on how Pluto 7 has played a glue between, like you said, there's a lot of learning comes working with some phenomenal customers around the world, and Pluto 7 with our solution planning in a box page and working with your team. Like, let's take, like you said, let's take that one problem that really matters. It's worth solving, the preventive or maintenance or predictive monitoring. Let's define the scope like a fixed scope, and let's define the time and price so that you can act fast. And these are some of the thought leadership that comes from your organization, partners like we adopt, so that our customers can move fast and not be in this uh, planned or incorrectly planned pilots, and which doesn't go to production. So we collectively want to increase the chances of success, to ensure that our mutual customers derive value.
Yeah, no, I totally commend you guys, first of all, for coming up with the fixed price, fixed scope program because it speaks a volume about your competency and capability and confidence on your domain expertise and how much you are ready for challenges to bring it on. That way you could solve them, as long as it's sort of fixed scope, for a guaranteed price. So it's very innovative. It has created a lot of excitement in our customer community. So I really commend you for forward thinking on that and working with us to produce those programs.
So Praveen, it's kind of we live in a very interesting world where intelligence is infinite and it's in our pocket. But we are always dealing with people, amazing people like you and customers like Levi's to AB InBev to Lexel to Corona to Hero. There are hundreds of customers. There are people behind it. People work with people, and that's where the bigger innovation comes in. And Google is such a phenomenal ecosystem that people use the Google technologies on a day-to-day in a B2C world on a day-to-day basis. Now that's coming into enterprise. So for us, it's working together, whether it's co-selling, co-delivering. It's a wonderful experience and opportunities for us as a partner and working with the ecosystem. Thank you for working with us and of course with our mutual customers, and looking forward for exciting time ahead. Praveen, before we conclude, do you want to share any words of wisdom for our mutual customers?
No, I mean, certainly, like we are living in an exciting time, right? In fact, we are at a very unique inflection point. Our CEO even compared it with the discovery of fire per se, right? What we could do. So it's a super exciting time in terms of what AI can do, right? And I think we're barely scratching the surface towards the ultimate AGI, even though there is a lot happening. Certainly, I'm very thankful for the partnership that Pluto 7 has and kind of the innovation that you are doing for our common customers. And certainly look forward to being back on other podcasts and continue our discussion on maybe some of our common customers.
Great. We'll do that. A lot more to come in not only this year, in the coming years. Thank you, Praveen. And this has been an exciting session and looking for more to follow. Thank
Thank
you
you.
and have a great day.
Thank you.